Maya's feet were killing her. She'd been on them for 6 hours straight, and her shift at the Grand Meridian wasn't even halfway done. She balanced 3 plates on her left arm while carrying a wine bottle in her right hand, weaving through tables like she'd done this her whole life. In reality, it had only been 3 months, but when you need money badly enough, you learn fast. The restaurant was fancy. The kind of place where appetizers cost more than she used to spend on groceries for a week. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling, and the carpet was so plush it felt like walking on clouds. Maya didn't belong here, not really, but the tips were good, and right now she needed every dollar she could get. She delivered the plates to table 7 with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. The customers barely looked at her. To them, she was invisible, just another server in a white shirt and black pants. That was fine with Maya. She preferred being invisible these days. As she turned to head back to the kitchen, her eyes caught the grand piano in the corner of the dining room. It sat there like a sleeping giant, black and beautiful, its lid propped open to show the strings inside. Maya's chest tightened. She forced herself to look away and kept walking. The kitchen was chaos. Chefs yelled orders, plates clattered, and steam rose from every direction. Maya grabbed her next order and headed back out, her mind already counting the hours until she could leave. 8 more hours. Then she'd take the subway to the hospital for the night shift there, sitting beside her little brother's bed, watching him sleep, praying the latest round of chemotherapy was working. Danny was only 16. He should have been worrying about homework and basketball tryouts, not whether he'd live to see his next birthday. Their parents had died 2 years ago in a car accident, and Maya had become his guardian overnight. She'd been 22 in her second year at Juilliard, studying piano performance. She'd had a scholarship, a future, dreams that felt real enough to touch. Then everything changed. There was Danny, sick and scared and alone except for her. There were hospital bills that insurance barely covered. There was rent and food and 1,000 other things that cost money she didn't have. So she'd left school. She'd packed up her tiny apartment near campus and found a cheaper one in a worse neighborhood. She'd taken the first job she could get, then added a second one, then a third. The piano in her apartment, the one her mother had saved up for years to buy, had been sold 4 months ago. That money had paid for 1 round of Danny's treatment. It was worth it. She'd sell everything she owned if it meant keeping her brother alive. But sometimes late at night she let herself remember what it felt like to play, to lose herself in music, to feel like her life had purpose beyond just surviving. Maya, her manager's voice cut through her thoughts. Roberto was waving her over and he looked stressed. More stressed than usual, which was saying something. We need to talk. She hurried over, her heart sinking. Had she messed up an order? Was someone complaining? She couldn't afford to lose this job. Don't look so worried, Roberto said, though he didn't look reassuring. Listen, we've got a situation tonight. Victor Ashford just booked the entire back section for a private party. His daughter's engagement? Maya nodded slowly, not understanding why this concerned her. Rich people booked private parties all the time. He's got 50 guests coming and he wants premium service. I'm putting you on his section. The tips should be incredible. Roberto paused. But be careful. Ashford's not someone you want to upset. He's got more money than God and an ego to match. Whatever he wants, you make it happen. Understand? She understood. Smile, serve, stay invisible. She'd been doing that for months. The party arrived an hour later like a hurricane of expensive perfume and designer suits. Maya had never seen so much wealth in one place. The women wore jewelry that probably cost more than she'd make in 10 years. The men talked loudly about business deals and vacation homes. And in the center of it all sat Victor Ashford. He was in his 50s, Maya guessed, with silver hair and the kind of tan that came from tropical beaches, not construction sites. He wore a suit that probably cost thousands, and when he spoke, everyone listened. His daughter sat beside him, glowing with happiness, showing off a diamond ring the size of a grape. Maya moved between the tables like a ghost, refilling wine glasses and delivering appetizers. She kept her eyes down and her mouth shut except to ask if they needed anything. This was good. If she did her job right, she'd walk away with enough tip money to cover Danny's prescriptions for the month. Everything was going fine until dessert. Victor stood up, champagne glass in hand, and called for everyone's attention. He made a toast to his daughter and her future husband, and everyone cheered. Then his eyes swept across the room and landed on the piano. "You know what this party needs?" he announced. "Music, live music." He turned to Roberto, who'd been hovering nearby. "Where's your pianist?" Roberto's face went pale. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Ashford. Our regular pianist called in sick this morning. We tried to find a replacement, but on such short notice—" "That's unacceptable," Victor interrupted. His voice wasn't loud, but something about it made everyone go quiet. "I'm paying a fortune for this venue. I expect entertainment." Maya was clearing plates from a nearby table, trying to be invisible, trying to disappear into the wallpaper, but she made the mistake of glancing at the piano just for a second. Just long enough to remember what it felt like to sit there, to let her fingers dance across the keys, to create something beautiful. That's when Victor's eyes locked onto her. "You." He pointed directly at her. "Come here." Maya's hands froze on the stack of plates she was holding. Every instinct told her to run, but her feet carried her forward. "You didn't ignore a direct order from someone like Victor Ashford. Not if you wanted to keep your job." "Yes, sir." Her voice came out smaller than she intended. Victor studied her with the intensity of someone examining a piece of property. Then his eyes dropped to her hands. Maya had scrubbed them clean before work, but she couldn't hide the calluses on her fingertips, the slight curve of her fingers that came from years of practice. "You play piano?" he said. It wasn't a question. I used to," Maya stammered. "But I'm just a waitress now. I haven't played in—" "I don't care about your life story," Victor interrupted. "Can you play or not?" Maya's mouth went dry. She could feel 50 pairs of eyes on her, including Roberto's pleading gaze. Her brother's face flashed through her mind, pale against white hospital sheets. She needed this job. She needed the money. She needed to say yes. "I can play," she whispered. "Excellent." Victor gestured toward the piano like he was granting her a great honor. "Play something nice. Something appropriate for a celebration." Maya's legs felt like they'd been filled with concrete as she walked toward the piano. Her hands were shaking. She hadn't performed in front of people since her parents' funeral, where she'd barely made it through one song before breaking down completely. After that, she'd locked her music away like a door she couldn't bear to open. She sat on the bench, and the familiar feeling of it made her throat tight. The piano was beautiful, obviously expensive, perfectly tuned. Her fingers hovered over the keys. Behind her, she could hear the guests settling back into their conversations, probably expecting some basic background music from a nervous waitress. Victor had already turned back to his daughter, satisfied that he'd solved the entertainment problem. Maya closed her eyes and let her hands find the keys. She didn't plan what to play. Her fingers just knew. They fell into the opening notes of Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major, the piece her mother had loved most, the one Maya had played at her funeral. And just like that, the door she'd kept locked flew open. Everything she'd been holding back for 2 years came flooding out through her fingers. Every tear she hadn't let herself cry while sitting in hospital waiting rooms. Every scream she'd swallowed while opening bills she couldn't pay. Every moment of exhaustion, of fear, of desperate love for the brother she was fighting to keep alive. The notes filled the restaurant, soft at first, then building. Maya wasn't playing for Victor Ashford or his guests. She wasn't even playing for herself. She was playing for Danny, for her parents, for the life she'd lost and the life she was clinging to with bloody fingertips. She was playing like her heart was breaking, because it was. The first thing that happened was the conversation stopped, not all at once, but like dominoes falling. One person paused mid-sentence, then another. Someone set down their fork. The clink of metal on china suddenly too loud in the shifting atmosphere. Within 30 seconds, the entire restaurant had gone silent except for the piano. Maya didn't notice. Her eyes were closed and she was somewhere else entirely. She was in her childhood living room, watching her mother's hands move across their old upright piano. She was in her tiny practice room at Juilliard, playing until her fingers ached, lost in the joy of improvement. She was at the hospital, holding Danny's hand while he slept, wondering if she'd ever feel whole again. The music poured out of her like water from a broken dam. Chopin had written the Nocturne as something beautiful and melancholy, but Maya was playing it like a story. Her story. The melody sang of loss and love twisted together so tightly you couldn't separate them. The softer passages whispered of exhaustion, of 3 a.m. vigils and double shifts and sleeping on subway trains. Then the music would swell, powerful and defiant, refusing to break no matter how much weight it carried. At table 12, a woman named Patricia felt tears rolling down her cheeks. She was a corporate lawyer, 53 years old, and she hadn't cried in public since her father's funeral 20 years ago. She'd built a career on being tough, unshakable. But something about this music was reaching into her chest and squeezing. She thought about her own daughter, who she barely saw anymore because work always came first. She thought about all the recitals she'd missed, the bedtime stories she hadn't read. The piano seemed to be asking her a question she didn't want to answer. Victor Ashford had turned back toward the piano. The satisfied smirk had vanished from his face. He stood there, champagne glass forgotten in his hand, watching this waitress transform his daughter's party into something else entirely. Something raw and real that didn't belong in his carefully controlled world. He wanted to be annoyed. He'd asked for pleasant background music, not this emotional assault. But he couldn't look away. The music shifted, moving into the middle section where Chopin's genius really showed. Maya's left hand maintained a steady hypnotic rhythm, while her right hand danced above it, creating melodies that seemed to float and fall like autumn leaves. Her technique wasn't perfect anymore. 2 years away from regular practice had cost her some of the precision she'd once had. But what she'd lost in technical perfection, she'd gained in something else, something that couldn't be taught in any music school. A man near the back stood up without realizing it. He was a hedge fund manager worth $200 million, and he was gripping the back of his chair like it was the only thing keeping him upright. The music reminded him of something he couldn't quite name, his childhood maybe, a time before money and success and the constant pressure to be more, have more, win more. He remembered being 8 years old, sitting on his grandmother's porch in rural Georgia, listening to cicadas sing while the sun went down. When had he stopped noticing sunsets? When had the world become so small that it only included numbers on screens and deals to close? Maya's fingers moved faster now, building toward something. The melody climbed higher, more urgent, almost desperate. This was the part where Chopin let all the prettiness fall away and showed you something true. Maya leaned into it, her whole body swaying slightly with the music. Sweat beaded on her forehead. Her fingers found notes she didn't remember memorizing, muscle memory taking over where conscious thought ended. Victor's daughter had stopped talking about her wedding entirely. She sat with her hand in her fiancé's, watching this woman she'd barely noticed before, and feeling something crack open inside her chest. She'd been planning this engagement party for months, obsessing over every detail. The flowers had to be perfect. The menu had to impress. Everything needed to prove to her father's friends that she was successful, sophisticated, worthy. But this music was stripping all that away, asking a more fundamental question. When was the last time she'd done something that mattered? Something real? The restaurant's other waitstaff had stopped working. They stood along the walls, trays in hand, transfixed. Roberto, the manager, felt his throat getting tight. He'd hired Maya 3 months ago because she'd shown up on time for the interview, and her references checked out. He'd never asked about her life, her story, why someone so young looked so tired all the time. Now he was watching her pour her soul onto a piano, and he felt ashamed that he'd never really seen her before. An elderly man at table 6 pulled out his handkerchief and wiped his eyes, not caring who saw. He was 81 years old, a retired federal judge who'd spent his life being dignified and in control. He'd buried his wife 6 months ago, and since then he'd been going through the motions of living without really feeling anything. Everyone told him time would heal. Everyone said it gets easier. But this music understood that sometimes grief doesn't get smaller. You just get better at carrying it. The piano was saying, I see you. I know it's heavy. You're not alone. Maya moved into the final section, and her playing changed again. The desperate urgency softened into something else. Not happiness exactly, but acceptance. The kind of hard-won peace that comes from surviving something that should have broken you. Her hands moved more gently now, coaxing out notes that sounded like hope with its eyes wide open. Hope that knew how bad things could get and chose to persist anyway. Victor felt something uncomfortable happening in his chest. He was a man who controlled everything around him. He'd built a tech empire from nothing, outworked and outsmarted everyone who'd stood in his way. He'd learned early that emotions were weaknesses other people exploited. Success required ruthlessness. Sentiment was for people who couldn't afford to win, but this music was getting under his armor. It reminded him of things he'd buried decades ago, His mother working 2 jobs to keep him in school, her hands rough from cleaning other people's houses. The music teacher who'd stayed late to help him with college applications, who'd believed in him when he was just another poor kid with big dreams. The promise he'd made to himself back then. If he ever made it, he'd help others climb the same way someone had helped him. When had he stopped keeping that promise? When had success become about accumulation instead of contribution? He couldn't remember. The years of deals and acquisitions and wealth building had blurred together into one long competition where the only goal was winning. But this waitress's music was showing him something he'd forgotten. Winning meant nothing if you won alone. The final notes came soft and slow, like someone too tired to pretend anymore. Maya let them fade into silence gradually, holding the last chord until it became more feeling than sound. Then her hands lifted from the keys and dropped into her lap. She opened her eyes but didn't turn around.
She couldn't face those people yet.
She'd just shown them everything, every broken piece of herself, and she didn't know how to take that back. The silence stretched. 5 seconds, 10, 15. Maya's heart pounded in her ears. She'd made a mistake. She'd been too much, shown too much. These rich people had wanted pleasant dinner music, and she'd given them bleeding honesty instead. Roberto was probably going to fire her. She'd lost the job, and Danny would lose his treatment. And everything would fall apart. And it was all her fault for not being able to keep her emotions locked down where they belonged. Then someone started clapping. Just one person, slow and deliberate. Then another joined in. Then another. Within seconds, the entire restaurant was applauding, and half the people in the room were on their feet. The sound washed over Maya like a wave, and she turned around, startled. They were all standing now. All 50 of Victor Ashford's guests, plus the restaurant staff, plus customers from other sections who'd stopped eating to listen. Some of them were crying openly. Others looked stunned, like they'd just witnessed something they didn't have words for. The applause kept going, growing louder, and Maya sat on the piano bench feeling more exposed than she'd ever felt in her life. She stood on shaky legs, unsure what to do. Should she bow? Should she run? Should she apologize? But before she could decide, Victor Ashford was walking toward her. The applause died down as everyone watched him approach. His face was unreadable, and Maya's stomach dropped. This was it, the moment he complained to Roberto and got her fired. But when Victor reached her, he didn't look angry. He looked almost confused, like a man who'd just woken up from a long dream and wasn't sure what was real. He studied her face the way he'd studied her hands earlier, but gentler this time, more human. Where did you learn to play like that? His voice was quieter than before, without the edge of command. Maya's voice shook. Juilliard. I had a scholarship. But I had to leave. She didn't explain why. She couldn't talk about Danny, about the hospital, about any of it without falling apart, and she'd already fallen apart enough for one night. Victor nodded slowly. He seemed to be thinking, working through something in his head. Then he asked, "Why did you have to leave?" And Maya, exhausted and exposed and too wrung out to maintain any defenses, told him about the car accident, about Danny's diagnosis, about leaving school to keep her brother alive, about the jobs and the bills and the piano she'd sold for drug money. The words spilled out of her like the music had, and she couldn't stop them. The restaurant had gone quiet again. Everyone was listening, though Maya didn't notice. She was looking at Victor, this billionaire who'd forced her to play, and watching something change in his expression, something that looked almost like recognition, like he was seeing not just her, but some earlier version of himself. When she finished talking, her voice trailing off into embarrassed silence, Victor stood there for a long moment. 50 people held their breath, waiting to see what the great Victor Ashford would do with this information. Then, he pulled out his phone. Victor scrolled through his contacts with the focused intensity of a man who'd decided something and wouldn't be talked out of it. Maya stood there, feeling like she'd said too much, exposed too much, made a fool of herself in front of 50 strangers who probably thought she was trying to manipulate sympathy from a rich man. Her face burned with embarrassment. "Dr. Richardson," Victor said into the phone, and his voice had shifted back into business mode. Sharp, direct, used to being obeyed. "Victor Ashford, I need you to review a patient's case immediately, tonight." A pause while the person on the other end apparently objected. "I don't care if you're at a dinner party. This is urgent. 16-year-old male, acute lymphoblastic leukemia. I'm sending you his information now." He turned to Maya, who was staring at him with her mouth slightly open. "Your brother's full name and what hospital?" Maya's brain couldn't process what was happening. What? "Name and hospital," Victor repeated, but not unkindly. Quickly. "Danny Torres, St. Catherine's Medical Center." The words came out automatically, even though her mind was spinning. "But I don't understand." Victor was already typing into his phone, his thumbs moving fast. "Dr. Richardson is the head of pediatric oncology at Columbia. Published more papers on childhood leukemia than anyone in the country. If there's a treatment option your current doctors are missing, he'll find it." He hit send and looked back at Maya. "He'll call you tomorrow with an appointment time." The restaurant had gone completely silent. Victor's daughter stood up, her hand over her mouth, tears in her eyes. Her fiancé looked stunned. The wealthy guests who'd come for a party were witnessing something none of them had expected. Victor Ashford, the man famous for his ruthlessness in business, having what looked almost like a crisis of conscience. Maya felt her knees go weak. "I can't afford a specialist at Columbia." "I can barely afford—" "You're not paying," Victor interrupted. "I am, consider it handled." "But why?" The question burst out of Maya before she could stop it. "You don't know me. You don't owe me anything. I'm just a waitress who played piano because you made me." Something flickered across Victor's face. For a moment he looked decades younger and infinitely more tired. He glanced around the restaurant at all the people watching, and Maya thought he might not answer. But then he did, and his voice was different than she'd heard it before. Quieter. More honest. 23 years ago, I was sleeping on a friend's couch in a bad part of Queens, trying to build a software company with $300 and a laptop I'd bought used, he said. I'd dropped out of college because I couldn't afford it anymore. My mother was sick, working herself to death to pay rent on an apartment that should have been condemned. I was going nowhere fast. He paused, and Maya realized this was probably the most personal thing Victor Ashford had said in public in years. The guests leaned in, as transfixed as they'd been during her performance. "I met a man named Richard Chen at a coffee shop where I was trying to pitch my ideas to anyone who'd listen. He was a venture capitalist already successful, and he had no reason to give me the time of day. But he sat and listened to this desperate kid explain a software concept he barely understood himself. And then Richard wrote me a check for $50,000, told me to use it to help my mother and get my business started. Said the only condition was that someday when I could, I'd do the same for someone else." Victor's jaw tightened. "Richard died 8 years ago. Cancer. I spoke at his funeral and promised I'd honor his legacy. And then I spent the next 8 years so focused on building my empire, on acquiring and expanding and winning, that I forgot what that promise meant. I convinced myself that my charitable foundation donations were enough, that writing checks to causes was the same as actually helping people." He looked directly at Maya, and she saw something in his eyes she hadn't seen before. Regret, maybe, or recognition. "But tonight, when you played that piano, something broke open in me. I saw myself in you. Not the successful version, but the version I was before Richard Chen believed in me. The version who was drowning and trying not to show it. The version who'd sacrificed everything for family and didn't know if the sacrifice would be enough." He took a breath. "Your music reminded me what actually matters, and what I've been avoiding." The restaurant was so quiet you could hear people breathing. Victor's daughter had tears streaming down her face. She walked over and hugged her father, whispering something in his ear that made him close his eyes for a moment. Maya felt like she was in a dream. A strange, impossible dream where billionaires had crises of conscience and waitresses somehow became the catalyst for changing someone's entire worldview. "I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," Victor replied. "But I'm not finished. Dr. Richardson is step 1. Step 2 is making sure you can focus on your brother without worrying about money." He raised his voice slightly, addressing the whole room. "I'm establishing a trust fund tonight. $500,000. It'll cover all of Danny's medical expenses, both past and future, and provide living expenses for both of you during his treatment and recovery." Maya's vision went blurry. Her legs actually buckled, and she grabbed the piano for support. $500,000. She'd been lying awake at night, trying to figure out how to pay next month's rent and Danny's medication costs. She had $11 in her checking account and maxed out credit cards. $500,000 was more money than she'd thought she'd see in her entire lifetime. "I can't accept that," she whispered, but even as she said it, she thought of Danny's pale face, his thin arms, The way he tried to smile for her even when the chemo made him feel like dying. I mean, I want to. God, I want to. But it's too much. Why would you? Because I can, Victor said simply. Because I should have been doing this all along. Because your music showed me I'd become exactly the kind of person I swore I'd never be. He smiled, but it was tinged with sadness. And because Richard Chen's investment in me turned into billions of dollars. The least I can do is pass that gift forward. One of the guests started clapping. Then another. Soon the entire restaurant was applauding again. But it felt different this time. People were crying openly now, including men in expensive suits who probably hadn't cried in public since they were children. Something about witnessing this moment, this strange alchemy of music and money and human connection, had cracked something open in the room. Roberto, the manager, was wiping his eyes with his apron. The other waitstaff looked stunned. Even the chefs had come out of the kitchen to see what was happening. Victor held up his hand for quiet. But there's a third thing, he said, looking back at Maya. And this one's not about charity. It's about investment. You left Juilliard 2 years ago. How far were you from graduating? 4 semesters, Maya said, her voice barely above a whisper. I was supposed to graduate next spring. Then you're going back. I'm paying for the rest of your education, and I'm connecting you with people in the classical music world who need to hear you play. He pointed at the piano. That performance wasn't just technically proficient, it was transcendent. You have a gift that deserves to be shared with more than just restaurant diners. Maya shook her head, overwhelmed. I haven't practiced seriously in 2 years. My technique is rusty. I probably couldn't even pass an audition anymore. Then you'll practice. You'll rebuild your skills. Talent like yours doesn't disappear. It just needs to be nurtured back to life. Victor's voice softened. I heard something in your playing tonight that I haven't heard in any concert hall, from any famous pianist. You played like your life depended on it, like the music was the only thing keeping you breathing. That's not something that can be taught. A woman in an elegant blue dress approached. She'd been sitting at table 8, and Maya vaguely remembered serving her wine earlier. Excuse me, the woman said, her voice cultured and careful. I'm Catherine Wells. I'm on the board of the Lincoln Center. If you're interested, I'd like to discuss performance opportunities once you're ready. Another man stepped forward. David Park, I run a classical music label. I'd love to talk about a recording contract. Suddenly, half the room was pulling out business cards offering connections, advice, opportunities. These were people who lived in a world Maya had only dreamed about accessing, and they were treating her like she belonged there. Like she mattered. Victor gently guided her away from the crowd, giving her space to breathe. This is going to feel overwhelming, he said. Take time to process it. Focus on your brother first. The music will still be there when you're ready. Maya looked at this man who'd been a stranger an hour ago, who'd forced her to do something she'd been avoiding for 2 years, who'd somehow seen past her waitress uniform to the person underneath. Why me? There must be hundreds of struggling musicians in this city, thousands. Because you reminded me of something I'd forgotten, Victor said. That money is just paper unless you use it to change lives. That success means nothing if you climb alone, and that sometimes the people who deserve help most are the ones too proud to ask for it. He smiled. Besides, you played Chopin like he should be played. Like every note cost something. I couldn't ignore that. Roberto approached cautiously, looking like he wasn't sure if he should interrupt. Maya, you're not fired, obviously. Take the rest of the night off. Take the rest of the week off. With pay. Maya laughed, and it came out sounding half hysterical. I don't understand what just happened. You played piano, Victor said, and you reminded a room full of people, including me, that we're all human under the expensive clothes and fancy cars. That's a rarer gift than you realize. His daughter joined them, her face still wet with tears. Thank you, she said to Maya. This engagement party was supposed to be about me showing off for Dad's friends, but you turned it into something real, something I'll actually remember in 20 years. As the evening wound down and guests started to leave, many of them stopped to press business cards into Maya's hands or whisper words of encouragement. The elderly judge told her she'd made him feel something again for the first time in months. The corporate lawyer said she was calling her daughter in the morning to apologize for missing so much. The hedge fund manager admitted he was rethinking his entire approach to philanthropy. When Maya finally left the restaurant at midnight, she had a phone full of contact information. a promise from Dr. Richardson's office for an appointment the next day, and the surreal knowledge that her life had just changed in ways she couldn't fully comprehend. She took the subway to the hospital like she did every night, but this time the tears on her face weren't from exhaustion. She found Danny sleeping, his chest rising and falling steadily under the thin hospital blanket. Maya sat beside him and took his hand. "You're going to be okay," she whispered. "We're both going to be okay." For the first time in 2 years, she actually believed it. 3 days after the night at the restaurant, Maya sat in Dr. Richardson's office at Columbia, watching him review Danny's medical files on his computer screen. Her brother sat beside her, looking small and nervous in the leather chair that was too big for him. He'd lost more weight recently. His hair was just starting to grow back from the last round of chemo, giving him a fuzzy appearance that might have been cute if it wasn't so heartbreaking. "I've been through your case thoroughly," Dr. Richardson said, turning away from the screen to look at them both. He was in his 60s with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. "Your current treatment protocol is sound, but I think we can do better. There's a newer therapy combination that's showing remarkable results in cases like yours. More targeted, fewer side effects." Danny glanced at Maya. "Is it expensive?" "Don't worry about that," Maya said quickly, squeezing his hand. She still couldn't quite believe that money wasn't an issue anymore. The trust fund Victor had established had cleared 2 days ago. $500,000 sitting in an account with her name on it felt like a number from someone else's life. Dr. Richardson smiled gently. "Cost isn't a concern here, Danny. My concern is getting you healthy. I want to start you on the new protocol next week. If you respond the way I think you will, we're looking at a very positive outcome." The word positive hung in the air like a miracle. Maya felt tears prick her eyes. For 2 years, doctors had been careful with their language, talking about managing symptoms and extending time and hoping for the best. Nobody had used words like positive outcome in so long she'd forgotten what hope felt like. Danny was crying too, not even trying to hide it. "Does this mean I might get better? Actually better?" "I'm optimistic," Dr. Richardson said. "Let's take it step by step, but yes, I believe we can beat this." When they left the hospital an hour later, Danny was exhausted, but smiling. Maya helped him into a taxi, another luxury she still wasn't used to. For 2 years, they'd taken the subway everywhere because it was cheaper. Now she could afford taxis. She could afford anything. The adjustment was almost harder than being poor had been. "Are you really going back to school?" Danny asked as the taxi pulled into traffic. "To Juilliard?" Maya had been avoiding thinking about that. The money was one thing. Danny's treatment was non-negotiable. But going back to school felt selfish, indulgent, impossible. "I don't know. Maybe. Eventually." "You should," Danny said firmly. He'd been saying this for 2 years, even when they'd been at their lowest. "You gave up everything for me. Now you can get it back." "I didn't give up anything. I chose you. I'd do it again." "I know. But that doesn't mean you should have to." Danny looked out the window, his reflection ghostly in the glass. "I hate that my being sick stole your music. That's the worst part of all of this." Maya's throat tightened. "Your being sick didn't steal anything. Cancer did. And soon it won't even have that." But Danny's words stayed with her after she'd settled him back in their apartment and headed to the tiny practice room Victor had rented for her in Midtown. It was barely bigger than a closet, with soundproof walls and a decent upright piano. Not a concert grand, but good enough to start rebuilding the skills she'd lost. She sat at the piano and stared at the keys. She'd been avoiding this moment since Victor made his offer. Playing at the restaurant had been different. She'd been forced into it, and emotion had carried her through. But this was practice, this was work. This was confronting how much she'd lost in 2 years of not playing. Maya started with scales. C major, hands separate. Her fingers felt stiff and unfamiliar on the keys. They knew where to go, but the movement wasn't smooth anymore. The calluses that had identified her as a pianist to Victor had softened. Her endurance was gone. After 15 minutes, her hands were cramping. She pushed through, moving to arpeggios, then to a simple Bach prelude she used to play as a warm-up. It sounded clumsy. Notes that should have flowed together stumbled into each other. Her timing was off. The dynamics were flat. She sounded like an intermediate student, not someone who'd been good enough for Juilliard. Maya stopped playing and put her head in her hands. This was impossible. She'd been fooling herself, thinking she could just pick up where she'd left off. 2 years was too long. She'd lost too much. Victor had wasted his money on her education fund. The people who'd given her business cards at the restaurant would realize their mistake as soon as they heard her play again. Her phone buzzed, a text from an unknown number. "This is Victor. How's the first practice session going?" Maya stared at the message, surprised he was checking in. She typed back, "Honestly, terrible. I sound awful." The response came quickly. "Good. That means you're being honest about where you are. Can't rebuild something if you won't acknowledge it's broken. Keep going." She read the message 3 times, then set her phone aside and went back to the scales. This time, she didn't expect them to sound good. She just focused on one note at a time, rebuilding the muscle memory her hands had lost. The weeks that followed established a rhythm that felt foreign but gradually became familiar. 3 mornings a week, Maya took Danny to Columbia for his new treatment. Dr. Richardson had been right about the side effects being milder. Danny was tired, but not the bone-deep exhaustion the old chemo had caused. He could eat without feeling nauseous. He even started gaining weight. The other 4 days, Maya practiced. 4 hours in the morning, break for lunch, 3 more hours in the afternoon. Her hands protested at first, cramping and aching. But slowly, painfully, the facility started coming back. The scales became smoother. The arpeggios flowed. She moved, from Bach to Beethoven, from simple pieces to more complex ones. Victor had also connected her with a teacher, a woman named Professor Lin who'd trained at Juilliard decades ago, and now took on a few private students. She was in her 70s, tiny and fierce, with a way of listening that made Maya feel completely exposed. "You're playing correctly," Professor Lin said after their first lesson, "but you're not playing truthfully. There's a difference." Maya frowned. "I'm following the score exactly." "Yes, that's the problem. Music isn't about following instructions. It's about communication. You're so worried about getting the notes right that you've forgotten to say anything with them." Professor Lin leaned forward. "When you played at that restaurant, Victor tells me you weren't thinking about technique. You were feeling. That's what I need you to find again." It was the hardest thing Maya had ever been asked to do. For 2 years, she'd survived by keeping her emotions locked down. Feeling too much was dangerous when you needed to stay functional. But Professor Lin was right. Her playing had become mechanical, safe, empty. "Play me something that scares you," Professor Lin instructed during their 4th lesson. "Something you're not ready for." Maya chose Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2. It was a piece she'd been learning before she left Juilliard, one that required technical brilliance and emotional depth in equal measure. She wasn't ready for it. Her technique still wasn't strong enough. But she played anyway. And somewhere, in the middle of the 2nd movement, she stopped worrying about the wrong notes and started feeling the music again. When she finished, Professor Lin was smiling. "There you are. That's what I've been waiting for." By the 3rd month, Danny was in remission. The word felt too fragile to trust, but Dr. Richardson was confident. The new treatment had worked better than anyone expected. Danny's blood counts were normal. The cancer cells were gone, or at least hiding so well they couldn't be detected. He'd need monitoring for years, but the immediate threat had passed. Maya cried in the hospital bathroom for 20 minutes, letting out 2 years of terror she'd been holding back. When she came out, Danny was waiting with a huge grin on his face. "Can I go back to school?" he asked. "Like actual school with other kids?" "Yes," Maya said, pulling him into a hug. "Yes, you can go back to everything." That same month, Maya auditioned for readmission to Juilliard. She played the Rachmaninoff, and despite her nerves, despite the technical imperfections, she played it with everything she had. The panel thanked her politely, and she left convinced she'd failed. The acceptance letter came a week later. Classes would start in the fall. But before that, Professor Lin convinced Maya to audition for the Young Artists Competition, a prestigious contest that could launch careers. Maya resisted. She wasn't ready. She'd only been practicing seriously for 4 months. She'd fail, and everyone who'd believed in her would realize they'd made a mistake. "You're not afraid of failing," Professor Lin said. "You're afraid of succeeding. Because if you succeed, you'll have to accept that you deserve good things. That's harder for you than losing." The observation hit too close to home. Maya had spent 2 years in survival mode, convinced that suffering was just her lot in life. The idea that she might actually get to be happy, that good things could happen to her, felt dangerous. Like tempting fate. But she entered the competition anyway. And on a Sunday afternoon in June, she walked onto the stage at Carnegie Hall for the preliminary round, sat at the most beautiful piano she'd ever touched, and played Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major. Not the way she'd played it at the restaurant, raw and desperate. And not mechanically like she had in those early practice sessions. She played it as herself, as someone who'd lost everything and found a way to keep going. As someone who'd learned that strength and vulnerability weren't opposites, they were partners. The audience sat in absolute silence when she finished. Then they stood, all of them at once. Maya advanced to the semifinals, then to the finals. She didn't win first place. That went to a technically flawless pianist from Taiwan, who played like a machine programmed for perfection. But Maya took second place, and more importantly, she caught the attention of critics and concert promoters. The reviews used words like emotionally devastating and heartbreakingly honest. One critic wrote, "Maya Torres doesn't play at you. She plays into you, finding the spaces where you're broken and filling them with sound." Victor was in the audience for the final round, sitting next to Danny, who looked healthy and strong, his hair grown back, his eyes bright. When Maya came off stage, Victor hugged her without hesitation. "Richard Chen would have loved you," he said simply. Maya understood that was the highest compliment he could give. That summer, before starting back at Juilliard, Maya gave her first professional recital at a small venue in Brooklyn. The tickets were cheap, the audience a mix of music students and curious locals. She played pieces she'd learned over the past 6 months, each one a step in her journey back to music. But she ended with the Chopin Nocturne. She'd played it so many times now that the notes were easier, more polished, but every time she let herself remember that night at the restaurant, the fear and exhaustion and desperate love that had poured out of her then. She'd learned that she didn't have to be drowning to play with emotion. She could be healing and still access those feelings, because they were part of her story now. As the final notes faded and the applause began, Maya looked out at the audience and saw Professor Lin nodding with approval. She saw Danny in the front row, alive and healthy and proud. She saw Victor, who'd shown her that sometimes the most powerful thing a person can do is use their resources to lift someone else up. And she saw herself, reflected in the polished lid of the piano, no longer hiding. 1 year after that night at the Grand Meridian, Maya stood backstage at Carnegie Hall, looking at her reflection in a full-length mirror. She wore a simple black dress, her hair pulled back in a neat bun. She looked professional, composed. Nothing like the exhausted waitress who'd served wine to rich people while dreaming of a life she thought she'd lost forever. Her hands were steady. That surprised her. She'd expected nerves, the kind that made your fingers shake and your breath come short. But standing here, minutes away from her debut recital at one of the world's most famous concert halls, she felt calm. Not because she wasn't scared, but because she'd learned that being scared didn't mean you couldn't still do the thing that terrified you. There was a knock on the dressing room door. "5 minutes, Ms. Torres." Maya took a deep breath and smoothed down her dress. Through the walls, she could hear the audience settling into their seats. Over 1,000 people, critics from major publications, musicians she'd studied and admired, record label executives, and somewhere in that crowd, the people who'd made this night possible. She'd seen Danny in the front row when she'd peeked out earlier during sound check. He was 17 now, healthy enough that sometimes she forgot he'd ever been sick. His hair had grown back thick and dark. He'd gained back all the weight he'd lost and then some. He'd finished his junior year of high school with decent grades and plans to apply to college. He looked like a normal teenager, because he was one now. The cancer that had defined their lives for so long was just a memory, something they'd survived and moved past. Next to Danny sat Victor and his daughter and son-in-law, who now had a 6-month-old baby. Victor looked older than he had a year ago, but in a good way. Softer somehow. He'd restructured his entire approach to business after that night, creating mentorship programs and funding scholarships for students from low-income backgrounds. He'd told Maya that she'd given him something more valuable than she'd realize. She'd given him back his purpose. Professor Lin was there too, sitting straight-backed in the 4th row, already looking critical. She'd pushed Maya relentlessly over the past year, never letting her settle for good enough, always demanding more honesty, more vulnerability, more truth. Maya had cried during lessons more than once, but Professor Lin had been right about everything. The only way to play music that mattered was to stop protecting yourself and let people see who you really were. Roberto, her old manager from the Grand Meridian, had a ticket. So did several of the waitstaff who'd been working that night. The restaurant had become something of a legend in New York's service industry. People told the story of the waitress who'd played piano and changed a billionaire's heart. Most people thought it was made up, too much like a fairy tale to be real. But the people who'd been there knew better. Catherine Wells from Lincoln Center was in the audience, along with David Park from the recording label. Maya had signed with him 6 months ago. Her first album would release in the spring, a collection of pieces she'd spent the year perfecting, not just technically but emotionally. Each piece told part of her story, from the grief of losing her parents to the fear of almost losing Danny to the strange, unexpected gift of second chances. 2 minutes, called the stage manager. Maya left the dressing room and walked through the backstage corridors to the wings. She could see the piano from here, a magnificent Steinway Model D concert grand lit by stage lights. Beyond it, the audience filled the hall's famous tiers of seating all the way up to the ceiling. So many people, all of them waiting to hear what she had to say. A year ago, that thought would have paralyzed her. But she'd learned something important from Professor Lin. She wasn't performing for the audience, she was performing with them. Music was a conversation, not a lecture. She was inviting these people to feel something alongside her, to remember their own losses and loves and moments of survival. If she could be honest enough, brave enough to be vulnerable, they'd meet her there. The stage manager gave her a nod. "You're on." Maya walked onto the stage and the applause washed over her like a wave. She smiled genuinely and bowed. Then she sat at the piano and adjusted the bench, going through the small rituals that gave her hands something to do while her mind settled. She flexed her fingers, tested a few keys, checked that the pedals were positioned correctly. Then she began. Her program opened with Bach, the Goldberg Variations. She'd chosen it specifically because it was technically demanding, but also emotionally complex, moving from joy to melancholy to transcendence. Bach had written it for a count who couldn't sleep, music to fill the quiet hours of the night. Maya thought about all the nights she'd sat in Danny's hospital room, watching him sleep, staying awake because she was too scared to close her eyes. This piece was for those nights. Her hands moved across the keys with confidence she'd rebuilt note by note over the past year. The muscle memory was back, stronger than before. But technique alone wasn't what made the performance work. It was the way she let herself feel the music, let it move through her without censoring or controlling it. She played the sad variations with the sadness they deserved. She played the joyful ones with genuine happiness. She let the audience hear her humanity. The Bach ended to strong applause. Maya stood, bowed, and sat back down. Next came Beethoven's Sonata No. 14, the Moonlight Sonata. Everyone knew the first movement, haunting and famous. But the third movement was what Maya loved, a storm of notes that demanded everything from the pianist. She attacked it with energy that surprised even her hands flying across the keys, pulling out the rage and frustration and stubborn refusal to give up that the piece contained.